Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne. And lately I've been rereading The Travels of Sir John Mandeville.
And I've been rereading Xavier de Maistre's Voyage Around My Room. So, listeners, please get yourself a comfy drink, pull up a seat, and join us for a conversation about these books and more here at the Spouter-Inn. Ho-yo-ho, ho-yo-ho, ho-yo-ho.
It's interesting we've both been rereading.
Well, it is, but, we've been talking about the travels of Mandeville for quite a while.
From the beginning, I think, almost.
And every time you said that, I've thought, I know a weird book that would be fun to pair with it that I've been meaning to reread for a long time, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So, I wanted to reread that. It was a great excuse.
No, so at last they're together.
But before we get to that, a little amuse-bouche to start the conversation with. I was wondering if you have a favorite minor work by a major writer. I guess you kind of talked about one last time in a sense because of the Milton poem that you looked at, which is not his most famous work or his second most famous work.
No.
But I wonder if there are any other examples that come to mind.
It's such a neat question, right? Because when we think about major writers, we almost always get drawn to whatever they're most famous for. One that I can think of is, I don't know if you've ever read these. Dante has this little cluster of 4 poems that he did called the Rima Petrosa, the Stony Lyrics. Have you ever run across those?
No.
You would really like those. Like, they're love poems. Like, they're super hot, right? So that makes them really enjoyable. But they're also about gemstones. So they've got this really weird kind of counterpoint of this very abstract kind of, almost kind of philosophical language, natural philosophy and like other kinds of philosophy, coupled with this very like charged kind of sense to the poems. So they're like a guilty pleasure. I like those a lot.
That's fascinating. I've read several minor works by Dante, and my favorite work of his, which I think we've only mentioned in passing, is the De Vulgari Eloquentia. It's his book about the formation of the Italian language or the ideal Italian language, amongst other things, which I really love because language, yada, yada. But I hadn't even heard of those. Wow.
Yeah, I only knew about them because there was this lovely little book that was written about them by Derling and Martinez years and years ago. And I ran across it because I was interested in like natural philosophy and like science and all that in medieval literature. And they'd mentioned it like the stone stuff. And so that led me to them. So they're like very odd, very like, I don't know, maybe one day we'll talk about them.
Yeah, maybe. I was thinking about this partially because, we talked about Beckett last time, or I talked about Beckett last time, and I have continued on, and I did go through and I read all of his dramatic works for stage and for television, and I watched the Beckett on film versions of them and tracked down some of the TV recordings that were done for the ones that were written specifically for television. A delightful thing to finally go through all of that. That was a sort of major chunk missing from my knowledge of Beckett, who's always been one of my favorites. And part of that process meant discovering Not I. I talked about this on my other podcast. I'll put a link in the show notes. But Not I is a short monologue for a single woman. And it's done in this like nonstop stream of words, it feels like. It just keeps going on and on and on. It's about 12 minutes, but the voice just keeps talking. She just keeps talking. And what you see on the stage is it's all supposed to be very dark, but hovering 8 feet above where the stage should be, lit by a very tiny spotlight, the only thing visible should be her mouth, the actor's mouth, speaking this hard to parse barrage of words where Beckett's instructions to the actors playing it was like, get on people's nerves. Don't try to act. Just use the words to get under people's skin. There is a filmed version of it starring the actor Billy Whitelaw. She does an amazing job. It is a close-up of her mouth. It's very kind of visceral because it's a mouth. And so you can sort of see the moisture of the gums, and it's very, very gross. And she's just talking and the mouth is flapping wildly, and it's horrifying, it's entrancing, it's dizzying, it's really remarkable, and I just loved it. And I was sad that I encountered it after we'd recorded the previous episode, and I couldn't talk about it because it's so good.
Is the camera fixed the whole time, or does it
Yes.
move?
Yeah. The camera is absolutely fixed for that film recording of it. Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about it would be such a different experience. You described that sort of visceral up close effect, and you get that from film or television. But when you're in a theater setting, it's a bit different, right? Because you're more removed and you're in a kind of, I don't know, you're maybe directly or you may be at an angle. It's like a different experience, right?
No, in the theater, it's this tiny thing that, like I said, is sort of floating above the stage. And so they're, the actor's in a contraption keeping them up in the air. And like they're often the head is placed in a kind of vice to keep it still because this very tiny pin light spotlight is supposed to go just on their mouth. When Billy Whitelaw did this on stage, she would say, it was claustrophobic. It was terrible. And yet she loved the piece. She loved doing it. She found a great inspiration from doing this piece, even though it was physically so difficult, at least at first, for her to do.
Wow.
And I'm sure, I've never seen it live, of course, but I'm sure it's a stunning visual to just see that mouth 8 feet above the stage, lit up, go on and on.
That's wild. It's neat that you've taken this like really deep dive into Beckett. You said it was work you loved for a long time, and just having the opportunity to really immerse yourself in it. That's very cool.
Yeah. And it's really great reading if you want to feel good about the world, because that's what Beckett's all about. He's the feel-good writer of your dreams.
You should realize that no living man can go to paradise. By land no man can go thither because of the wild beasts in the wilderness, and because of the hills and rocks, which no one can cross, and also because of the many dark places that are there. No one can go there by water either, for those rivers flow with so strong a current, with such a rush and such waves that no boat can sail against them. And so no man, as I said, can get there except through the special grace of God. And so of that place I can tell you no more. So I shall go back and tell you of things that I have seen in the isles and lands of the empire of Prester John, which, relative to us, are below the earth. Mandeville's Travels, or as it is called in some of the early manuscripts, the Book of John Mandeville, is a remarkable text. Existing in hundreds of manuscripts and many printed editions, it's a medieval bestseller that has continued to be read into the early modern period and beyond. Columbus had a copy with him on his sea voyages, and Sir Walter Raleigh quotes Mandeville when he describes the Amazons to be found on the coast of Virginia. Even though we tend to see this book as an early example of the genre of travel writing, there was no such genre in the Middle Ages. What they did have was guidebooks to direct you along pilgrimage routes in Rome or Jerusalem, and summaries or relations of missionary trips from Europe into various parts of Asia. Mandeville's book stands apart from these, though, in that the devotional content is embedded within accounts of marvels. In fact, some of the early manuscripts actually call this work the Book of Marvels. And these marvels are nested within a peculiar vision of the world, which is a balanced unity that is, paradoxically, chock full of diversity. And we can't really talk about a biography of Mandeville, or of the author in general, because the name's apparently a pseudonym. The author tells us all about himself in the prologue, but it hasn't been possible to line up these details with any historical figure. The book was written in Anglo-French, that is, the kind of French used in medieval England. But based on some of the works it quotes, it seems like it was actually composed while the writer was in Flanders or France, over on the continent. And the writer frequently refers to England not only as his homeland, but as the key point of reference in his description of world geography. And finally, even though this book claims to recount travels all over the world, most of the material, especially for the more eastern regions, is actually taken from other books. And so some people describe Mandeville as an armchair traveler. But it's possible, too, that he was a combination, a traveler who explored the world to some extent, but whose travels were shaped and understood through the books that he had read. The one thing we do know with some precision is when the Book of John Mandeville was written. It has to have been at some time in the late 1350s, because we find early manuscripts from that period, but we also see him quoting works that can be dated just a couple of years earlier. So there's a kind of a window there. We also know how rapidly this book took off. There were no less than 4 Middle English translations within 50 years, so by 1400. And there were translations in Latin, Irish, Franco-Italian, Czech, Danish, Dutch, German, Icelandic, and so on. There are over 300 manuscripts, which is like bestseller, like unheard of for medieval texts, a huge number. And all of these versions in the different languages and the multiple versions within individual languages, they all differ from one another, as each text was tailored to its own audience. One writer, Ian Higgins, has referred to the Book of John Mandeville as a medieval multi-text, and he calls its many versions textual isotopes, which I think is a really neat way to refer to it.
I had never read this book before, but I had heard a lot about it because people like to talk about it. And now that I've poked about it a bit, I understand why. It seems like a very charming book that gives you lots of things to say because he talks about lots of different people of the world and has a lot of wild stories about them.
Yeah, and it's like, the thing I find most fascinating about it, like the marvels and the weird stories, like those are awesome. But the thing I find most absolutely fascinating about it, and this is actually the thing I find fascinating about the medieval world in general, and it's why I became a medievalist, is the system of thought, like this idea of how the world is organized, like how you make, we talked about this before, I think, how you make sense of the world, whether it's the theory of the elements or the music of the spheres or why it is things fall down and, bubbles go up. I find it fascinating, this way of understanding the world, and Mandeville is fantastic for that.
So how does Mandeville organize his world?
It's really interesting. Like there's one particular passage where he kind of gives you, I guess you would say, astronomical kind of sense of the earth, where he talks about how the earth is shaped. And he specifically describes, I mentioned a little earlier how England is kind of his point of reference. When he's talking about the shape of the world, he says Jerusalem is at the center of the world, and England is as far from Jerusalem as this other place he's going to talk about in remote India, Prester John's land is. So he's like, as far as you would go up from England to get to Jerusalem, so you would go down to get to Prester John's land. And it's a little bit hard to visualize because when we say Jerusalem's at the center of the earth, we tend to think about flat maps. So as if you have like a flat map and then in the middle of it, there is Jerusalem. And there's a tradition, we've talked about that in our episode about the Hereford map. But Mandeville is talking about this three-dimensional sphere. And so when he says you have to go up, he's talking about moving along the curvature of the world to get to Jerusalem and then down again to get to Prester John's land. So it's this weird kind of, I guess, like inhabiting the world of the medieval map, the flat map, like the Hereford map, but also trying to visualize how it all works as a sphere and what the relationship is of the parts that are in balance with one another. So there's all kinds of interesting things he says about England on the one hand and Prester John's land on the other that are meant to give you a sense of them as being kind of opposite, yet the same in their opposition. And this principle organizes the whole world. That's really weird.
Yes. And he also uses that to make some statements about Jerusalem as the sort of center of the world, as the place that is most medium. I think he says, moderation in all things, and the most moderate place is the place that's the most in the middle, and therefore the most perfect place is the place that's in the center of the world, Jerusalem.
Of course.
That's why Jesus chose to be born there.
Yeah. No, he gives you all these different ways to understand it as the center. Like in terms of climate theory, he's going to, give you a sense of Jerusalem as being in the fourth climate that is the most moderate climate. He'll talk about this sort of legendary fact, quote unquote, that if you have a stick and you put it up at noon, it will cast no shadow because Jerusalem is in the center of the world. It's symbolic, but it's also literalized in this weird kind of way.
Yeah.
But so there's all this I guess I don't even call it fanciful kinds of, but coupled with this desire to make it all make sense, that there has to be a balance. It all has to hang together in some kind of way. You said that this is your first time actually dipping into the text. What were the things that struck you about it? Like, what did you find charming?
Well, I found it interesting that in the opening parts of the book, there is an explicit call to the Crusades. There hasn't been a crusade in a while, so
let's get on it.
I thought I would go out there and, look over this place and let people know how they want to get to the Middle East just in case. And so I had some expectations with how it was going to treat the different peoples of the world with that kind of mindset going into it. And there is that, but it's not quite as simple as that. His descriptions of Islam and Muslims are not ideal, but not nearly as terrible as I expected them to be. Yeah,
no, his view of Islam that he presents in one of the chapters where he describes an interview with the Sultan of Babylon.
Yes.
It's comparatively speaking one of the more accurate and fair-minded kinds of takes on Islam that you find in medieval European Christian literature. His description of Jewish people is entirely different. I don't know if you encountered that. That happens quite late in the book when he's talking about Alexander the Great's enclosure of the tribes of Gog and Magog.
Oh, I've heard about that, but I didn't read that passage.
Yeah,
No.
it's worth noting that, when you're talking about depictions of Islam in Mandeville and you're thinking about, it's important to mention what he does with the depiction of the Jews, because you might think, oh, he's got this kind of ecumenical, relatively positive view of religious diversity. And it's just not true, because it's quite generous on the one hand and then really paranoid and savage on the other. So that is interesting too, like accounting for that. I can't think of any medieval Christian European text that does that, because they're either quite negative about both or less negative. I'm really struck by this. Like, so Langland, for example, is equally relatively tolerant, right? Others are equally negative. And so Mandeville's odd in doing both.
Yeah. That also came up in the discussion about Islam, that, both his thoughts on the Jews and Islam's thoughts on the Jews, and neither of those were particularly complimentary. But also, of course, Islam's belief or Muslims' beliefs on Christians, which, was sort of negative. Like in that conversation with the Sultan asks our author, we are told, this might be the part where we start to doubt whether this actually happened or not. But either way, it doesn't matter. This is a trope. This is how we do this.
It's an illustrative anecdote.
Exactly. And the Sultan is asking, do Christian rulers rule well? And he's like, yeah. And then,
he's like, yeah, well enough.
Yeah. And the Sultan is like, no, they're really not living up to Christian virtues. They know Christ's teachings and don't live up to their own moral code. And that's not good. Mm-hmm. And so, that becomes a way of critiquing Christianity, or not Christianity, but Christian rulers and their lack of adherence to the faith through the Sultan as a authority figure, which is an interesting position to put him in.
Yeah, it's really neat because the Sultan says all this and kind of gives this critique. And you notice the narrator does not object or deny it. He's like, when I'd heard the Sultan speak these words, I asked him with great respect how he came by so full a knowledge of the state of Christendom. It's like, yeah, true enough, right?
Yeah.
And then he explains, how he's gathered this information. And so it's like you said, it's an authority figure kind of giving this critique which can come back.
Yeah. And also, the Sultan speaks French well. So he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting small detail that, like, I guess this whole conversation happened in French. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's interesting that he would be presenting the Sultan as someone who knows French. How well, I mean, it's possible. I don't know.
Well, this is a passage that I think, like you said, it's fictitious in the sense that it's a kind of constructed exchange, but it's also reflecting all kinds of interesting realities in the world of this time in the mid 14th century. So one of them is, you were saying about this kind of call for crusade that's invoked in the opening pages of the book. At this point in the 14th century, the whole crusade momentum has really fallen apart. It's not happening in the way it was in the 12th century, even into the 13th century. So it's not a realistic aspiration anymore. Crusade is much more kind of invoked as a kind of a vision of reform, of the kinds of things that have to be straightened out in society. And this passage with the Sultan is definitely part of that. The other thing that it's doing that's kind of neat is it's connected to a whole series of medieval stories that show up in French and Italian and so on that are about Saladin. And I don't think we might have talked about him a little bit before when we were doing our episode on Dante's Inferno, when we were talking about the virtuous pagans, I think. So it's a long while ago. But a figure who's a really important military leader in the 12th century, right in the same period as Richard the Lionhearted. There's all kinds of like stories that, survive from that period that relate to them. And so there's a whole a series of fictions that appear in French and Italian literature that are about making Saladin kind of part of the European story as well. They sometimes describe him as having had a French or other kind of European mother. They'll also tell this story, which is the one that Mandeville is repeating here, about how he gets his information about what's going on in the world. He says, the Sultan brought in these 4 great lords who described to me, says the narrator, all the manners of my country and of other countries in Christendom as fully and as truly as if they had always lived in them. These lords and the Sultan spoke French wonderfully well, And then he says, finally, I understood that the Sultan sends some of his lords to different kingdoms in the guise of merchants, some with precious stones, some with cloth of gold, some with other jewels. And they visit all realms in order to size up the manners of us Christian men and spot our weaknesses. So that's absolutely coming over from the Saladin tradition. There's also a version of this that shows up in Boccaccio. I think it's 10:9. It's the Messer Torello story that describes, again, this merchant's encounter with Saladin. And he describes this. So there's a whole rich tradition all bundled up together in this little narrative in this chapter. And again, that's one of the reasons why Mandeville's so interesting, because you'll get a little story like this and it's connected to a whole constellation of related narratives. And you can imagine this is one of the reasons why it took off like gangbusters.
Oh, yeah. Although also, I think one of the things that is very entrancing about it, at least in the translation that I was reading, it was written very much in the second person. If you or if one wants to travel to see this, here's what you might do, and here's what you might see along the way. And it's very much explicitly inviting you to imagine yourself seeing these sights and hearing these stories and talking with the Sultan yourself. And there's something really compelling about that. It's really encouraging you to take the mental journey. It's holding your hand as you take the mental journey, I suppose, more so than many travelogue books do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's really helpful to think about there not really being a travel literature genre yet. And this is one of the places it's happening. And that holding by the hand and addressing you and bringing you along, and even the affective quality of some of it, I think is really coming from the ways in which pilgrim narratives are serving as a kind of a template or a foundation for what this book is doing. So structurally, you'll have noticed that there's that opening, that prologue in the opening chapter, which are exactly about, if you want to go to Jerusalem, this is how you do it, right? So it starts with this really long sentence. Most of the translations don't give it to you as one sentence, but it's actually like this insanely long sentence that's got all these if you punctuate it in a modern translation, it's got a lot of semicolons, because it's sort of since this land is over there, this is where Jesus chose to be born, where he performed his miracles, yada, yada, yada. It's almost like a legal document, whereas, since, and also. And then it finally gets to, you actually making this trip. And there's a little brief bio he gives of himself there before he comes back to, at the beginning of chapter 1, the ways you can go. In other words, the actual directions. And it's not just one way, it's multiple paths. So if you go from this country, you can go through Germany and Hungary. If you go from this way, so he gives you all the different practical alternatives. But once you get into the Holy Land itself, and especially as you get close to Jerusalem, that's where that really emotional, I guess you would say, that affective part, that hand holding is, look, here are the drops, these white drops on the pavement mark the places where the Virgin Mary's milk dropped on the stones. Here are the places where you can see the footprints of Jesus and you can step in them yourself, right? That kind of thing where you're brought along. And then once you get beyond Jerusalem, you just carry forward, I think, some part of that affective engine, I guess, into the further parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess also the fact that it is this combination of, things that you're going to see and the stories that you're going to learn, that you would learn if you were there, that you are learning from reading the book and hearing them related by the author, mixed with the very practical things, which, I guess you might expect some of that. But that is also one of the things that I was most charmed by, of hearing, okay, you're going to go across this stretch of land, which is kind of desert, but there's enough stuff along the way that you don't need to worry about food. But when you get to Arabia, if you want to see Mecca, that's going to be real rough, because it's just sand. Nothing is growing there. And it'll take this many days, and here are some practical things. That texture of what it's like to travel in the 1300s. How long does it take, and what is on a granular level, what is it like to travel long distances in pre-modern eras? And you get a sense of that from this.
You do. It's funny because you get a bit of a sense that there are texts that you can get a much, much crisper sense of the actual logistical stuff you really need. There are these little itinerary things that some of them, they'll often have vocabulary you need. It'll give you short little phrases that you might need as you're going to, where you're traveling. They'll give you how much it should cost for certain kinds of things, certain kinds of supplies and so on, or to make a particular crossing. It'll tell you how much it should cost to do that. It'll also tell you how many days it should take at different times of the year. So there are these little guide things, the pilgrim guides, that are like really like just the facts, like the practical stuff you need. And Mandeville, I think, is kind of interesting because it's got elements of that practical journey guide, but overgrown with this voluptuous kind of exuberant, I don't know, I'm visualizing an overgrown garden with all these like marvels and wonders and like eye candy of different kinds, which is why the book, again, like this will be a feature of the travel literature genre, as it gets out in the world. It'll one and the same time be available to you as something you might use as you get ready for a trip. And like I mentioned earlier, like Columbus has a copy of Mandeville, Raleigh, early travelers, like in Hakluyt's Travels, which is a sort of early modern travel guide, I guess, that was compiled. The first edition also includes Mandeville, a version of Mandeville. So people are looking to Mandeville to give you practical advice, at least to some extent. But the vast majority of people who are reading this text are reading it because, like, this is so great to imagine. This is such a good helper to imagine this trip. So it's really neat that's that double function. So it's kind of practical, but really it's this incredibly imaginative, or it's also this incredibly imaginative companion.
Yeah. When I was an undergrad studying Latin in a classics program, even though I planned to go into medieval stuff, I learned about Pausanias, the 2nd century CE Greek writer and traveler who has a lengthy description of Greece that goes into tremendous detail. And I got very excited hearing about it because I thought it would be something closer to Mandeville.
Yeah.
And I mean, I haven't touched it in decades. I was very disappointed when I opened it up. It was very dry about here's this monument, here's where you go. It was much more like how you're describing the practical itinerary documents from the Middle Ages. And, I guess I read Pausanias and gave up pretty quickly and didn't explore that kind of literature.
You're like,
in the
that was
following
enough.
centuries. Like, yeah, no, I know what that's like. It's great if you're doing a history book and you want to find out things, but like, this is significantly more compelling as a read.
Yeah, no, it's got all, you'll remember when we did the Hereford map episode. I don't know if you remember this, but we talked a little bit, I think, about prose mappae mundi. In other words, there are these actual maps, right? And they've got all these place names written on them. And the Hereford map is a particularly voluptuous example of it, right? But there are also these prose ones that just list in order like place names. Occasionally there's a little bit of additional detail, but it's basically place names. And people have kind of debated about exactly what these were for. Were these just meant to be standalone references, or would they actually be used to help you when you were making a map as a sort of, this is the information you have to make sure to get onto your map. So you're not just copying a model, you're also using this prose mappae mundi. And so that's also kind of part of the Mandeville tradition. I guess that's one of the reasons I find this book so fascinating is you can embed it in this mapping tradition, or you can embed it in this devotional pilgrimage tradition, or you can embed it in this sort of encyclopedic tradition that is accounting for the theory of everything. So there's so many, it sits on so many seats kind of.
Or you can read it for the wild stories about dragon women.
That too.
I don't know if you have any favorite stories like that from the book.
No, there's all kinds of, or the assassins, when he's talking about the earthly paradise, and he's like, yeah, and also there's this one place where there's an old man called the Old Man of the Mountain, and he keeps all these young men there, and he gets them all really, really doped up, and when they're high as a kite, he like tells them about all these like marvels and wonderful things they're going to experience when they go to heaven, and then he's able to send them out as assassins because they'll do anything for him, because they imagine they're going to go to this incredible paradise. Bizarrely enough, this has some basis in fact, because he's talking about the assassins, which is a sort of a Shiite, I don't want to say sect, but there's like a kind of a community of assassins that was developed at a certain point in the Middle Ages, and the story found its way back into medieval Europe. And so when he tells the story in there, you're like, wow, that's insane. But actually there's a factual basis for it. So these stories are kind of remarkable.
That is great. Yeah, the one, I mean, there were many, but one of the ones that really caught me comes towards the end of the book in the very distant lands where, much like we saw on the Hereford map, like the distant lands are where the absolutely wild things happen. And so there's another island with attractive, excellent people where it is customary on the first night after a couple are wedded to take a certain appointed man and have him sleep with the wife to take her virginity. And then a whole discourse onto like how this is done and why it happens. And It's because the women hide serpents inside them that sting their husbands.
Sure.
It was very strange that this book took such a horny turn.
Yeah.
But, it keeps you reading.
And at other times, it's very chaste. So one of my other favorite sort of story-like passages is this description of Prester John's palace. I don't know if you saw this. So there's all kinds of interesting features about this land of Prester John, which is diametrically opposite England. So it's like that in that balanced kind of point of reference. It's far east and furthest India. And the king, Prester John, is also believed to be Christian and therefore is going to be part of this ultimate reclamation of the Holy Land. So there's all kinds of spiritual baggage to the whole story. But there's also incredible luxurious wealth and chastity. So when he rides with his private company in time of peace, there's carried before him a wooden cross without gold or painting or precious stones in remembrance of the passion of Christ. He also has carried in front of him a golden plate full of earth as a token that, in spite of his great nobleness and power, he came from earth and to the earth shall he return. And there's carried before him another vessel, full of gold and jewels and precious stones like rubies, diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, topazes, chrysolites, and many others, as a token of his nobility, power, and might. You immediately will recognize my love of the list coming out there, right?
Yes, yes.
But also the gates of the palace are precious stones. The steps are all different stones. They're set with gold. His throne is made of emerald, edged in gold. And best of all, the frame of his bed is of sapphire, set in gold, to make him sleep well and to destroy lustful thoughts. For he only lies with his wives, plural, on 4 set occasions in the year, and even then for the sole purpose of engendering children.
I did see that passage. It's really something.
It's super virtuous, and yet, wow, there's a lot of opulence.
Yeah. And I don't fully know the theological status of having multiple wives at this point within Christianity.
Yeah, no, frowned on within Christianity, I'm pretty sure. But he's, he's way out there, and it's like,
Yeah, so I don't know. There's an interesting tension there, I guess. It's all very strange. It was also a little strange for me because while I was a little bit familiar with the idea of Prester John, ruler of this distant Christian kingdom that it might be hard to access, my understanding comes from, I guess, a later tradition where that is roughly Ethiopia.
Yeah. Well, it's because in the Middle Ages, they don't really, in Christian Europe, they don't separate out Ethiopia and India. So there's many Indias, there's multiple Indias, and one of them is India Ethiopia.
Ah, okay.
And so that's how Prester John in the earlier period from the 12th century on is in India. But then once there's actual exploration going on, and especially the Portuguese are down there in Africa colonizing, that's when they start thinking Prester John is in Africa because they're like, oh no, Ethiopia's over here.
Also, I should add, Prester John, it is revealed, is named after the original Prester John, but Prester John is just now the word for emperor, basically, it turns out, which made a lot of things clearer once I read him explain that, because he would talk about how Prester John's children would marry the Khan of Cathay of China. They would exchange daughters to marry each other. And I was like, how does this keep happening? How long has Prester John been doing this? It's like, oh no, Prester John's just the name of the job. Okay, sure.
Yeah, the whole Prester John thing is very complex and enigmatic because so when we hear about the Mongols, I mean, there's a historical background there. There's actual circumstances, right? The whole Prester John thing starts out as this very elaborate sort of apocalyptic fantasy of somebody is going to come from the east to help us out and deal with these pesky Muslims. So it shows up in the 12th century in Otto Freising's Universal History. It's just there's a reference in the 1140s to this. And then there's this letter of Prester John that shows up a little later in the 12th century. And it's I, Prester John, let me tell you all about my kingdom and I'll be along in a snap to help you with those pesky Muslims. And then it just shows up in all these, on maps and in these, and so I don't know, it's a kind of a fantasy that gets anchored in a bunch of different specific locations from the 12th century to the 16th century.
Yeah, it was interesting to see another variant of it because I'm less familiar with the tradition, but I had encountered it a bit.
Where had you seen it?
Oh, medieval history 101 type class. Mm-hmm. So I don't remember if it had shown up in literature. I have seen it mentioned in literature and encyclopedias and things like that.
Yeah, it shows up all over.
Yeah, it shows up everywhere.
But again, that whole quality of Mandeville, right? So there's all this factual stuff out there. This things that actually exist in the world, like actual historical circumstances. And then there's this wild embellishment. It's almost like you can imagine, I don't know, if you had just like the barest bones of like a description of, I don't know, our world today, and then somebody embellished it with like elaborate fantasy. And so that's kind of neat.
All the stories they knew about it. Yeah.
Exactly.
You mentioned that the itinerary books would give useful phrases that you might need when traveling, like a good tourist phrase book and so forth. And he doesn't do that here, but he does give you alphabets.
I love those.
Yeah. Now, because I'm the person I am, I have read a fair number of medieval grammatical treatises, and they love giving you a tour of the alphabets of the world. So I am accustomed to this part and this rhetoric. I thought it was interesting that they were sort of spread out throughout the text, and that you get to, okay, now here's the Jewish alphabet. Now that we've talked about this part of the world, and now here's the Saracen, as it was in my translation, the Arabic alphabet, et cetera, et cetera. I love that. There was nothing that you were supposed to do with it except look at them. They were not accurate, generally speaking.
The Greek one, which is the first one that shows up, is pretty much right.
Yeah.
But the other one's like, no. Except there's a really interesting anomaly that's worth noticing. So, one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 12, has the Hebrew alphabet. And it's just nonsense, right? But in one particular manuscript of Mandeville, it's from the later 14th century, and it was produced at the patronage of Charles V of France. The alphabet, the Hebrew, they've put it in actual correct, good Hebrew alphabet.
Oh.
Isn't that fascinating? So it gives a beautiful example of how these textual isotopes, as Ian Higgins calls them, do their own thing, right? So clearly the context of the production of that manuscript, somebody is pointing out, somebody knows enough to know that you want to have an accurate Hebrew manuscript in there, and they take the trouble to actually get one.
Yeah, and there are often accurate alphabets in these grammatical treatises. So, it wasn't impossible that somebody could say, that's clearly corrupt, I'm going to fix it.
Exactly. It's such a neat move, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And some of the versions, the alphabets drop out. Other versions, there are more alphabets that proliferate and get added in. So it's choose your adventure.
So we've talked about this as an interesting look into medieval understanding of the world, about one person from the Middle Ages' specific understanding of the world. Is this a fun book for someone to just read, so to speak, who isn't specifically looking for that kind of historical knowledge?
I mean, it's hard for me to imagine, right? Because I'm obviously captivated by the weird medieval world here, right? But I think if you're a person that's interested in travel literature, like how do people talk about travel? What is travel literature for? I think it's a really interesting book to read from that point of view. Because like I said, the genre doesn't exist before this, right? And this book plays such a huge role in establishing it as a genre. And like I said, inhabiting all these different kinds of discursive frames is part of the reason why I think it has the power it does and took off the way it took off.
Yeah, I also think it's one of the more compelling versions of this kind of medieval book, so to speak. The I don't know, not all of them are geographically based or travel based, but collections of interesting stories that are connected through a history or through a list of kings or through something else. Like, this is a pretty readable and compelling version of it, at least in some translations. Mm-hmm. So, and it gives you access to those odd stories that you read about, and you're like, I can't imagine thinking this story is legit. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that feeling is something that draws a lot of people to medieval or pre-modern in general, but very specifically medieval literature. And, go encounter that. If you haven't read that kind of book, this is a good one.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's a book you can very much read beginning to end if you want. Like, if you want to get a sense of the how do you move through the world. But you could totally also just dip into this book. It's very trippy.
Yeah.
Like any chapter is enjoyable.
If it's getting too bogged down in something, you can just move ahead. There's no through line.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you loosely in the sense that like it starts out like, here's the prologue. You want to go to the Holy Land. These are the like 4 different ways you can go there. And then you get an account of Constantinople, right? Or Istanbul, right? So you're on your way. You're making your way through Turkey. Then there's a few chapters that are all about Jerusalem and the Holy Land's environs. Then he sort of goes around a little bit, Egypt, that general neck of the woods, Persia, and then, onward to Prester John's land, exploring India, farther into China. There's a particular period where he talks about the earthly paradise, but oops, you can't go there because it's sealed off. He's really bummed about this. So there is a kind of an itinerary. You get a sense of like movement through space, but you don't have to take that path.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what I was saying is that, if you miss out on one part of it, you're not missing knowledge that you'll need to understand what happens later.
No.
So yes, you can pick and choose.
Yeah, you choose your adventure.
My room is situated at 45 degrees latitude, according to the measurements of Father Beccaria. It runs from east to west and forms a rectangle that is 36 paces around, keeping well nigh to the walls. My voyage, however, will encompass a great deal more, for I shall often walk across it lengthwise and breadthwise, and diagonally too, following no rule or method. I shall even zigzag this way and that, and follow every line possible in geometry if necessary. I do not care much for people who so control their steps and ideas, who say, "Today I will pay 3 visits, write 4 letters, and finish the piece I have begun." My soul is so open to every manner of idea, taste, and sentiment, it avidly takes in everything that turns up. Xavier de Maistre was born to an aristocratic family in 1763 in Savoy, which is now part of France, but was then part of the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. And when he was in his 20s, he was a military man. And in 1790, when he was about 26 years old, he fought in a duel. This was illegal. And so he was put under house arrest for 42 days, apparently restricted just to his room, though, he had a servant. It's fine. But bored out of his mind, he decides to write a little book to pass the time, A Journey Around My Room. And his older brother, Joseph de Maistre, encouraged him to publish it, and so it was published in 1794. Now, do you know who Joseph de Maistre is?
No, I don't know him.
Okay. He was a writer and a philosopher. The brothers, as I said, were aristocrats. They were living through the late 18th century around France. They were very much targets of the French Revolution.
I was just going to ask. Yes, it's a spicy time.
Yeah. So they were pretty much against the French Revolution. Joseph's philosophy was strongly in favor of the church, the monarchy, the social stratification that propped him up in the world. Today, he is considered one of the founders of European conservatism. So, yeah. Xavier was also a counter-revolutionary, but when you read this little book that he wrote, it doesn't really come up. He's a person with a servant. He feels entitled to that servant. He spends time in aristocratic circles, but that's also true of all the characters in Pride and Prejudice, right? So instead of getting a polemic, we get a charming, weird little book, a travelogue of someone who makes this heroic journey basically from his bed in one corner of his room all the way to his writing desk in the other corner of his room. He'll have a lot of encounters along the way, his armchair, his books, his artwork, a portrait of the lovely Madame de Hautcastel, and like Mandeville, he'll stop at each of these sites and explain its significance or tell the stories behind it, or, he'll basically follow his thoughts wherever they might lead him.
So what happened to him after the revolution?
After the revolution, eventually Xavier headed off to Russia, lived most of his life in St. Petersburg, doing political and literary work there, and also painting. He would write a few other short works, including a sequel, which we'll talk about, I suppose, and passed away in 1852 at a ripe old age. But yeah.
What an interesting guy.
He does seem like an interesting person. And while he might have had some problematic political opinions, he was not as terrifying as his brother was.
It's a low bar, but...
Exactly. Had you heard of this book before, other than me mentioning it every so often?
Only from you mentioning it. And honestly, it's years ago, because I think we were thinking about doing Mandeville as early as the year we started this, in 2019. And you had said, from the get-go, you had said, I know just the book to put with this.
So I think you had a poke into the book.
Yeah. And I have to say, I was chuckling when you're reading the passage, because when I was poking around in it, I noticed that passage and I was like, wow, Chris will really love that passage. So I'm delighted that was the one you chose. It's so precise.
It is very precise, and it's also sort of setting up the scale, and it's also very silly, right? He's talking about how big this space is that he's gonna cross, which isn't that. I mean, it's a pretty big room, but it's not that big a room.
I shall even zigzag.
Yeah, exactly. He's painting himself as very heroic. You can very much feel, guy in his 20s with a lot of big thoughts. And the book is like that. The book is weird and charming and very, very digressive.
Yeah. One thing I was struck by, though, was this thing he comes back to over and over again. And I'm sure you've thought about this a lot. This distinction between like his sort of conscious mind and this sort of animal self, that there's these two selves almost that are always there in tandem.
Yeah, this becomes one of the ideas that he thinks about and returns to a few times. It's a philosophical idea that he uses to explain a few things, like why you get distracted reading, because
I love that passage.
It was so good. Your mind wanders off in flights of fancy, but your body keeps going.
He's like, have you not been, where you're reading a passage and you read and read and read, you get to the end of the page, you have no idea what you just read?
Yeah.
That's this. He's like, that's that experience.
Or when you're making breakfast and your mind starts going on a flight of fancy, but your body is still touching a hot pan and then it burns itself.
I mean, who has not had this happen, right?
Yeah, it's a philosophical idea that like he investigates, he has fun with. He doesn't hold to it, like he's not trying to, he's just having fun with it, I guess is what I want to say. There is a sort of long conversation between his soul and his beast, his mind and his body, however you want to phrase it, that happens towards the end of the book. It's kind of the climax of the book. It's kind of not. It's just another chapter. It's fine. There is, as I said, a sequel to this book. And in the sequel, he's like, I'm old now and I don't care about any of that body and mind duality anymore. That sort of worked itself out now that I'm in my 50s.
Yeah. It has this kind of ominous quality, though, in Voyage Around My Room, where there's this one passage where he's talking about how this phenomenon happens when he's out walking and he loses sight completely of where it is he's going. He discovers he's on the doorstep of Madame or Mademoiselle something. I don't remember her name. And he's like, oh, it's like a lucky thing I didn't go in there in that state of mind, or she wasn't home or whatever. And I'm like, like he's distinguishing between this like conscious mind and then this like the animal, right? The beast that is almost not a person at all. And I thought, oh, it's a bit creepy, isn't it, to think about it in those terms?
There is definitely a creepy moment there and in a few other places, though he insists that he's always a gentleman about these things. And of course, the book is filled with high drama. He has a dog, and his servant brings him lunch, and the dog does a thing, and he bonks his head, and he gets startled, and it's all very like he has to lie down for a bit, and he gets very irritable towards his servant, and then he realizes that the servant hasn't like properly brushed his coat or something because he's forgotten to pay the servant.
God.
So, like, these are the dramatic moments in his life, and he's going to pitch them as high as he can, and he's going to make fun of himself as well in the process. And it's very delightful. The book that it most reminds me of is a book that we haven't really talked about, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman.
Ah, is that a book you'd like to do together one time?
Well, it's a book that meant a lot to me. I read it when I was younger. It's a book that every time I've tried to revisit it, I've sort of not been able to get very far into it. So I don't know. I don't know if it's just one of those books that you can only read once. I don't know. I mean, I know other people have read it more than once.
I have exactly the same sense of curiosity because I also stumbled across it when I was very young, loved it, was absolutely in love with this book. And then like years ago now, but many years after I'd first read it, I picked it up because I think I was looking for, something to teach or whatever. And I thought, oh, maybe that would be good. And it was very difficult to get back into. And I don't know if it was just where I was at that particular moment when I tried to go back to it, but I'm also very curious about it. So we might consider that.
Just for listeners who haven't read it, this is a novel that was published in the 1750s and 1760s by Anglo-Irish author Lawrence Sterne. It follows the life of Tristram Shandy, gentleman, and it begins where all good biographies should begin, at the moment of his conception.
Begin at the beginning.
You begin at the beginning, and it describes the moment of his conception where one of his parents gets distracted at the worst possible moment and is just not having their head in the game, and that is where all his troubles began. I don't think he's born until the second book, if I remember correctly, of 9. Like, it takes a long time for anything to happen because it will just discourse on and digress and find itself in all these rabbit holes and pull itself out of them. And it just kind of goes nowhere. And it's a lot of fun along the way.
And I seem to remember it having all kinds of crazy and interesting layout and format things. Am I right about that?
Yes, there are all sorts of what we would now probably consider postmodern, but like metatextual things going on where there's a page that's entirely black out of mourning for one of the characters.
That's right.
I think there are several chapters that are intentionally missing because it gets a little rude. I forget the details. It has been decades since I've read it, but it is amazing.
So did Xavier de Maistre know this book, or was it just part of the... Oh.
He admired Sterne quite a lot. He refers to it. He makes a reference to it. He talks about his hobby horse, which Uncle Toby's hobby horse is one of the big recurring motifs in Tristram Shandy. He absolutely is taking that as his most direct model for how to have fun in a book.
How interesting. I'm not accustomed to thinking about English writers as models for French writers, more the converse. So it's unusual, I think, or at least in my experience is unusual.
Yeah. Do you know another writer who is a big deal for him?
No.
Ossian.
You're kidding. Oh, how bizarre.
The Gaelic fictional poet. This epic poet that was invented by a Scottish poet named James Macpherson in the 1760s as well. There's a whole section in the sequel where he wants to write a proper opening dedicatory epistle or something in his book, and he is inspired and he's just trying to like say these Scottish names that he has such difficulty with, and so he's screaming them at the top of their lungs, and as he goes on it becomes more French style until finally the neighbor downstairs tells him to knock it off.
That's excellent.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that he has these literary references. And I mean, he's got a tremendous library with him, and he talks about the various books that he likes. He loves to share in the fictitious woes of novels, which, I think that's fair.
He's a young man.
He's a young man. He's got a lot of high spirit, and he is very horny.
Yeah, well, and he's like locked up, right?
Yeah, but there are like 3 things that remind him of the women that he has lusted after, of 3 different women that he's lusted after. The color of his bed sheets, they are white and rose, I think, just like what his dear Rosalie wore.
Oh, gee.
There's one point where he's polishing a portrait of the Madame de Hautcastel, and it just gets to be too much for him. God. Polishing a portrait has never sounded so dirty.
Yeah. One of the moments I found really interesting was like right near the end, because like I said, I dipped into it in different places. And he talks about his day of freedom. Like, in other words, I guess the house arrest is coming to an end, kind of. And he says this really weird thing. I wonder what you thought about it. He said, "So today is the day of my freedom, or rather the day that I shall put my shackles back on. The yoke of worldly matters will weigh heavy on me once again. I shall no longer take a single step that is not measured by decorum and duty." And so it's this like neat upside down kind of thing where being imprisoned was in a weird way maximum freedom in a certain sense.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of interesting.
He talks about this earlier on in the book as well. He tries to make it out, and he's very clearly doing a bit, but he tries to make it out that, well, he was planning on doing this anyway. Right. Like he was hoping to spend some time on his own in his room and do a voyage through his imagination and whatnot. Unfortunately, he had to do it because apparently killing somebody over a minor grievance isn't cool anymore.
Alas.
Alas. And he just wished that it had happened during Lent and not Carnival. Like, it's very silly. But he spent the whole time, he spends the whole early point saying, no. This isn't because I have to be in my room. It's because I would want to. And in fact, you should want to as well, because you too could travel like this. Anybody could. You just need a room, and you all have a room. Anybody could afford this travel. It's not like reading, he doesn't mention Mandeville, but it's not like reading Mandeville. You don't have to spend all this money traveling and going everywhere. No, anybody can do this. It's incredibly liberating. It reminded me of Boethius.
I was just going to say it was reminding me of Montaigne in a way, because that whole idea of being, that whole idea that even if you're in this confined space, you're also kind of entirely in the space of your mind, right? Which is paradoxically like super capacious, right? It's a small space. It's a very big space.
And the stories that you find within it can be just as strange and marvelous as what you find at the edge of the earth in these other travel books.
Mm-hmm.
So I really enjoy it as a unexpectedly odd piece of literature, as something smaller and easier to return to than Tristram Shandy, but still giving some of the same vibes of playfulness in what a book could be and how it would be laid out. And
yeah, you said that later in life he wrote a sequel.
He wrote a sequel called Night or Nocturnal Voyage Around My Room. Almost 30 years later, and he's trying to recreate it. It's not as good as the original, I think, but there's some charm to it.
You must bump into the walls.
You must. He actually spends quite a while in that book. He goes out on his balcony. He sees a pretty woman downstairs. He has a whole thing because while he's not quite as horny as he was when he was young, it's still there. And as he goes back in, he spends a rather long period of time sitting in his window, on his window, with one leg on one side and the other leg on the other side, riding it like a horse and talking about how good a steed this is. And he just spends like the final third of the book in this spot thinking about things, thinking about being led by the head versus being led by the heart. That kind of is the new version of his mind-body dualism from this book. And eventually he just regrets that architects aren't thoughtful enough to put windows in the shape of saddles. Like, that would make this much easier.
Isn't that interesting? That sort of in-betweenness, like windowsills, doorways, like liminal spots, right? Like you're in this world and not, it's like, it's in some ways very, very different from the first book where you're enclosed. Here you're like on the edge, right?
Exactly.
Weird.
So yeah, both delightful and again, a very sort of different take on what a travel book might be. And on that note, I wanted to bring up two other books that were on my mind. We're not going to talk as much about them, but I think they're both really interesting pieces to this conversation about like, well, what else? What is sort of this other alternative forms of travel? What might that be? Or other variations on this, like going around the world and noting all of the different things, Xavier de Maistre went around his room and noted all the things and the stories attached to them. I want to talk about a guy named Daniel Spuri. He was born in Romania in 1930. His family emigrated to Switzerland during World War II. He was an artist, and he made these assemblages, these assemblages, which sort of captured or snared things in a chaotic and haphazard state. So like one of his early works is just taking the remains of his girlfriend's breakfast, the plates, the glasses, the silverware, the eggshells in the egg cup, the ashtray, and like affixing it to a board onto a chair and then hanging it on the wall sort of at a 90-degree angle from how you'd expect it. So the perspective is all off, but it lets you see sort of this haphazard part of life in a new way. And in 1961, he was preparing a gallery show for his art. And, gallery art shows, they often will make a little promotional postcard to give out to everybody. Mm-hmm. He asked the gallery if that money could be put towards making a little booklet instead, something I guess like what we would now call a zine.
Uh-huh.
And so on the 17th of October, 1961, at 3:47 p.m., he drew a map of every object on his desk.
I love that.
All 80 of them. And then he wrote up little annotations for the object. And this was the first edition of the book, which is called An Anecdoted Topography of Chance.
Huh.
By chance, think not like rolling dice, but like where things happen to be.
That's so cool.
And then that was the first edition. But over the years, he would invite a bunch of his friends, including a lot of artists associated with the Fluxus movement of experimental and, fun time writing. Robert Filiu, Emmett Williams, Diderot, who would annotate it and then annotate the annotations and annotate those annotations, talking about where these objects came from, their relationships with the various artists that were in their circles, all the stories behind them, making jokes with each other about the kinds of annotations they had written before and so forth. I have an edition that came out in 1995.
Uh-huh.
which is presumably the final and most complete version. Spouter passed away in 2024. But I wondered, I've just got it here. There are 80 objects, I believe. If you want to just give me a number from 1 to 80, and I'll see what you've ended up on.
64.
64. 64. Corner of a half-liter container of milk.
I love milk.
Blue Circle brand. This container is one that has taken my fancy and contains, in effect, a lesson in applied geometry. Cylindrical at the start, it ends up in a pyramid. Then there's an annotation that is a quote from the Petite Eco Diététique from 1960, talking about Blue Circle sells milk in this special container at the same price as bottled milk. It is the ideal container of milk. This simple and hygienic modern method for distributing pasteurized milk comes to us from Sweden, a country with a very high dairy reputation and in which hygiene has advanced as nowhere else. And that goes on for a while until we eventually get Diderot has added another annotation to that. What complications, what filth, what extremes, what a mingling and mushing, what excrements. So, you get an object, you get a little example of the history of that object, of how it was being talked about. You get some jokes, weird jokes being made by the other artists. Often there'll be things that were like lent to them from other artists. You might hear a bit about this party or that party, or how so-and-so gave this piece and Rauschenberg did this or whoever did that. It's a very fun book to flip through and dip into. I mean, you could read it front to back, I suppose, but it's also just fun to open it up and see what you find.
I was just looking up to see if I could find an image of the drawing of the top of the desk, and I did find it, and it's numbered. It's got this sort of schematic, and it's so interesting because it almost reminds me of like paint by numbers and things like that, But instead of ink or paint coming in to fill it, you go out to the text that is associated with each one of the numbers. It kind of turns the whole expectation on its head.
Yeah. It also looks like one of those, for me, I always think of the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band with all the different faces and like the guides with the outlines of all the different people to tell you who is who.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. But it's very interesting. There's also somewhere in here, there's a appendix, which is an anecdoted topography of order.
Really?
Which just shows a much tidier desk with the same kind of outline and only like 7 different things to look at.
Gosh.
So yeah, it's this like moment frozen in time that allows you, through these same kind of stories, access to a whole subculture of, mid 20th century artists hanging out with each other that have then also gotten this textual accretion on it where they're writing to each other and adding to. There's a bunch of like entries that are just like wood screw or screw. And then somebody will have an annotation that's like, this is a good minimalist note. Emmett's going to love it. and then there's one from Emmett, which is like, yes, I approve of this note. It's delightful. I don't know. They're having fun. They're having a lot of fun.
Yeah, there's like a whole community there, right? They're doing it together.
Yeah. So different, ways of exploring the objects and the stories in the space. The other side of it was another book that I wanted to bring up, which is by an author that we've discussed before, Georges Perec, another one of my favorite authors, and it is called An Attempt at Exhausting a Place in Paris. I don't know if you know about this book.
You've mentioned it before. I had not encountered Perec until you first sort of turned me on to him way back when we read his W, or Memory of Childhood. That was absolutely terrific. I really enjoyed that a lot, so I'd be happy to read more of him.
This is a nice small book that was more of it started out as a bit of a writing exercise, I suppose. Mm-hmm. He sat in the Place Saint-Sulpice in Paris for 3 days, and he attempted to write down everything that he saw, focusing in particular on the things that you'd be less likely to notice. Other people have talked about the churches and their history, the kind of things that Mandeville might have talked about. Other people have talked about like this architectural feature, this fountain, this elaborate fountain in the middle of it, and why it is the way it is and what the meanings of the statuary is and all that stuff. Perec wants to look at everything else and just practice noticing all this stuff. And so it is just kind of a big list of things. It very much feels like unedited jottings from a notebook that occur over 3 days, over Friday, Saturday, Sunday, where he's sitting in the various cafes at this plaza and, just counting a lot of buses. A lot of buses go by, and he gets really interested in the buses. And as it goes along, he's occasionally interrogating himself about what he's doing. And like, why am I keep focusing on the buses? I was like, well, the buses, they kind of provide a little bit of a rhythm for all the other more random stuff that's happening.
That list-like quality sounds really delightful.
Yeah, it is very sort of breezing through it. Let me read a bit for you. 3 children taken to school. Another apple green 2 CV. Again, the pigeons go round the square. A 96 passes by, stops before the bus stop, Saint-Sulpice section. Off it steps Geneviève Sereau, who takes Rue de Canette. I get her attention by knocking on the window pane, and she comes over to say hello. A 70 passes by. The funeral chimes stop. A young girl is eating half a palmier. A man with a pipe and black satchel. A 70 passes by. A 63 passes by. It is 5 after 2. An 87 passes by. People in waves, still, continually. A priest returning from a trip. There is an airline label hanging from his satchel. That's like the texture of the whole book.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like, it's very film-like, you know what I mean? Like you get the rhythm of like just people on the street.
Yes, and I think it's also film-like because, at least to my mind, as the text goes on, as he gets a little bit bored of all the buses, he really seems to aim more and more for these moments where the small detail tells a bit of a story or suggests a bit of a story, right? The priest is returning from a trip with an airline label hanging from his satchel. Like, you can get a little bit more context about what his whole deal is than you can from the young girl eating a pastry.
Yeah. He's been somewhere, right? He's traveled.
Yeah. And I believe, I want to say that his original plan, Perec's original plan, was to do this for much longer.
How long is it that he does it for?
It's 3 days. And by the 3rd day, he's
done.
Pretty clearly bored. He's gotten what he's going to get out of this exercise. He sort of calls it early in the afternoon and the book just kind of stops. It is 5 to 2. The pigeons are on the plaza. They all fly off at the same time. 4 children, a dog, a little ray of sun. The 96, it is 2 o'clock. That's the end. But I don't know. This is interesting because it's sort of doing the opposite of what I liked in Mandeville. It's sort of not holding your hand. It's not trying to explain anything. It's just the notes. They're very rarely fleshed out into much of a story, just sometimes the implication of a story. And yet there's something in it where you do feel like you're in the middle of this space from now 50 years ago in Paris, seeing what's going by. You certainly recognize some of the differences in terms of how people live today, as well as the similarities. There are still pigeons, there are still buses, but nobody's on a cell phone.
Yeah, it's strangely vivid. It's almost like a series of glances or something. Or like I said, like that film quality where it's just like, it's the view of a street. This thing happens, that thing happens, this other thing happens, and it's just one thing after another, right?
Yeah. And there are people that, the author recognizes and has interactions with, and a lot of people that he recognizes the type of, let's say, and a lot of people that he just doesn't, that he can't really make sense of, but he can still see them and recognize that they aren't usually seen, which is also, I think, a very interesting approach to take for it. Like, what gets left out of Mandeville's book? And how much of that there is, right? The infinity of it all. But, it's also reasonable that it gets out. Like, he can only do it for so long.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the last page of it because I pulled it up while we were talking together. And there's this really interesting thing Perec says in the last page. It says, rarity of complete lulls. There is always a passerby in the distance or a car passing by. And so that there's always something there, right? There's always somebody who's in the distance. There's always a car. There's always something. And it's so interesting how that kind of runs counter to the flickering of image after image after image after image. Like, there is no emptiness, kind of. And it's just so different from the narrative structure that we see in something like Mandeville, right? Where it's like everything is all folded out and fleshed out. This is just the barest bones, right, of experience.
There's a weird footnote to this book's life. I'm sure there are many of them, actually, but there's one weird one that I didn't know until I was reading up on it for this. A guy named Boris Razon wrote a fictional version of the book. I don't 100% know what that means, but I think he took this book as inspiration for a novel called Écoute. One chapter of that novel was turned into an opera libretto.
How bizarre.
The person who wrote that opera libretto then turned it into a film.
You're kidding.
And that film is Emilia Perez.
No.
That is the wildest
That's insane.
chain of connections. And I just never expected that. I don't know.
That's crazy.
Things are weird. Things are weird out there in the world. Well, I think you've been traveling a bit because you came up here and I got to see you recently.
That was so nice. I was really happy I was up in Toronto for a couple of days for work. And so there was a chance for visiting too, which is excellent. But then I got stuck in the big snowstorm.
yeah, that has happened. And that snowstorm has kept me mostly in the house for a while. So I feel like reading,
Voyage autour de ta chambre.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that book did have a bit of a resurgence during the pandemic for reasons that are pretty clear, I think. But even a snowstorm can get you feeling like that. That is also some of the reasons why our January episode isn't coming out until the middle of February. But I'm hoping that next time around, we will be able to do something real quick and dirty and get us back on our tracks, back to schedule.
That would be fun, actually. We could choose things that let you kind of handle it in that light and quick kind of way. That'll actually be fun.
Yeah. And hopefully our listeners don't expect every episode to be a treatise on some major work. It's just books. Books are neat.
It's just
books are fun. Has anything else been going on with you? Has your book come out?
I did have I think I might have mentioned this before. I had a co-edited collection on textiles and manuscripts that came out, which is, was a really beautiful, fun project. Like sometimes it feels like editorial projects are less significant or less meaningful than things you write all by yourself. But on the contrary, sometimes there are opportunities to do work all together that no one of you could ever possibly do on your own. So this is a really neat collection. I think if you're interested in textiles or you're interested in early books or you're interested in the interconnected pre-modern world, because there's book traditions that are addressed there from all around the world, from like lots and lots of different places. And also anybody who just likes pretty pictures, because we were able to persuade the press to let us put in a lot of color photos. And it looks really pretty.
So the book is out now?
Yeah, it appeared officially, I think, January 26th, though I'm still waiting for a physical copy to get to me. So I have not yet actually touched it. I've seen it in its digital avatar form, but I haven't actually held it in my hands yet.
And is it one of those academic books that is priced out of people's reach, or is it something reasonable?
Reasonable, right? We tried really hard to keep the price down as much as we could, but we also knew we needed a lot of pictures, because if you're talking about textiles, you need to show the textiles, and you need to show them often with multiple sort of comparative shots and really close up. So it's got like something like 150 illustrations, like it's lots. So the price is not as low as I would have liked for it to be, but it's okay.
Yeah.
And also I think authors, as always, will oblige if anybody asks to get a PDF of something. I'm pretty sure authors are always very obliging about that.
Yes, that can certainly happen.
Yeah.
And of course, your library might have a copy as well. So
yeah.
just so people aren't surprised if they go looking for it.
Are there things that you're looking forward to once you're not snowed in anymore?
I'm waiting for the weather to get above zero so I feel comfortable going for nice long walks again, I suppose. Other than that, I am kind of, I don't know, I spent a lot of January having difficulty having the attention to read. So that seems to have broken now. So I'm excited to just read a bunch of stuff again. I mean, the Beckett plays, but those are kind of small and et cetera. So part of me is like, well, should I go and, read through his novels now? I don't know. Beckett in large doses can be a lot. That's all I'm saying.
Maybe you need a little break. Maybe you need something light.
I am absolutely thinking of lighter things as well. And also thinking about, our next episode, which might be some lighter, funner, easier to read, quicker to get through stuff. Although, Mandeville was a lot easier to read than I expected.
Yeah.
And shorter than I expected.
Yeah. No, he's a hoot.
Well, all right. Until then, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We would love to hear from you. This show is made possible by people like you supporting us on Patreon, and patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. You can find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/89. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.